Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from... My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome Rosalee de la Forêt. Rosalee is an educator, clinical herbalist, and structural medicine specialist. She is the author of the recently released book, Alchemy of Herbs. Rosalee, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. And so we'll jump on into question one. Rosalee, were you a weird kid?
Yeah, I was a weird kid. I think probably on multiple levels. For one, I grew up in Utah, which for people who may not know, Utah is predominantly of the religion of the Latter-day Saints or Mormons. And I was not Mormon. And so that I was definitely not a part of the kind of cultural paradigm that was going on. So I always kind of felt outside of things. And I was also very introverted. And I loved to spend time outside by myself. I loved to read. I remember when I was even young, like second grade, so I can't remember how old that is, like probably 8 years old or so, I would fake sick so I could stay home and read because I really didn't want to have to go deal with all those people. I'd rather just read on my own.
And what kind of stuff were you reading?
Well, I can't say that I have like a lot of pride in what I was reading when I was in like second grade necessarily. I remember like lots of Nancy Drew. Actually, one of my favorite books when I was very young was Girl of the Limberlost by Jean Stratton Porter, and that's a book I've probably read 20 times. And I just found the heroine of the story to be so amazing. She fearlessly goes through her bog and captures moths and butterflies, and is just a naturalist, really immersed in her landscape, and I really loved that book a lot.
And are you from a bookish family, or did you have a sympathetic librarian nearby?
Yeah, my older sister says that we were raised by librarians. My mother was an archaeologist, and she was very involved with her work, and my dad had his thing, and she said we just lived at the library. I kind of don't remember that young part of my life, but I do remember the library where we lived, and I remember knowing all the librarians, and I remember reading all the books. So yeah, I think my family also did read, and I definitely remember just as soon as I caught on to reading, I went with it. Been a reader ever since.
Were you in Utah for your mother's work? Was she working on sort of First Nations in the area?
Yeah, she was. She worked with the Kusharam tribe, which is a part of the Paiute Nation, and that's more like central Utah. And then she also worked on the Arizona Strip, kind of by the Grand Canyon, and she would call that her office, the Grand Canyon.
Well, there are certainly worse offices.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So a kind of intellectually independent, pro-reading type of kid. When it comes to, I mean, was the interest in the natural world always there? I mean, you mentioned a book that is principally about it. Is that something that's always there, or was it a discovery in your teen years, for instance?
Yeah. So kind of the waves of it. I was lucky, I think, in my childhood to be raised. I was raised in St. George, Utah, which at the time was very small. And so we were surrounded by nature and wilderness, and we spent a lot of time camping and hiking and getting out. So there was certainly that interest from being a young child. And I remember going on a hike in the area, and I don't remember the details, but there was someone leading the hike, some kind of organized event. And I remember them showing us the plant Mormon tea. And the guide said that we could just take a little bit of the tea in this plant and chew on it. And I remember like mind blown. I was like, wow, you can just eat like wild plants. So I remember that very succinctly, but I would say, through my teenage years and stuff, I didn't have as much of that nature connection. And it really kind of solidified in my early 20s. I finished college and I was going to go to France to teach English there, and I took kind of a major right turn in my life. And I ended up staying in the Pacific Northwest and going to a school that was primitive living skills school.
So were you studying, English lit or something, and that was the kind of idea about going to France, or was it just you're going to take some time off because you're
Uh-huh.
young and France is lovely?
Right. Well, there's that. I've been obsessed with France since I was a teenager, and I actually majored in French and Spanish in college. And so that was kind of I thought, oh, I'll just go really live in France and I'll teach English as a second language. And so I just thought that was like I had a foreign languages degree, so that seemed like the next logical step. But I'm really grateful for that right turn. I'm sure I would have had a great time in France, but I
What was it?
started.
What was the right turn? What happened that you think actually no, I'm going to go primitive skills instead of like
Hmm.
croissants and bicycles?
Hmm. Well, part of me wishes I can say that I had this, light from heaven, but it was because of a boy. I met someone and we started dating, and he was really into that type of stuff. And I hadn't really, that wasn't really a big thing on my radar, but he was into that. And through his like obvious enthusiasm and love for it, I became more and more enthusiastic about it myself. And so I
Well, it's not
started.
light from
Uh-huh.
heaven, but maybe heaven put the boy there.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. He was a great gift in my life. No doubt. Yeah. So yeah, that was a really transformational experience for me because I had to completely shift my entire paradigm about the way I thought the world worked when I went to that school. And it was slow. It was kind of like that slow transition until one day it just hit me like a bam kind of thing. And I went from seeing civilization and cities as being kind of like the major cornerstone of what's going on in our society to recognizing this greater world of nature and the wilderness and all of its many facets. And that became a bigger part of my life. And when I started, I didn't know really any plants at all. And I remember the first day of the class, I learned what a plantain weed, like plantago, was, and I learned what a cedar tree was. Like I definitely started out from ground zero, and from there, it's like this. I lived in the Pacific Northwest, so it's very, lots of rain there, very lush, lots of green things, and I went from all of that being like this wall of green. This is like, oh, that's a plant, that's a plant, that's a big plant, that's a small plant, to not only knowing their names, but through this, I spent years at this school and I really learned how to incorporate those things into my everyday life, whether it was making baskets or making cordage or starting a fire or building a shelter or using the plants for food and for medicine. And it was a really empowering time in my life. It was, like I said, very transformational, and that I really just began to see the world in a different light.
So how intensive was this course? Did you have to build a structure to live in, or did you live like a normal and then learn how to build the structures?
Yeah, so there was mostly living normal, and then we did have, weekends, or I did a couple of weeks where we went out and lived in the primitive sculpture things like we call a debris hut. So basically, you pile up a bunch of debris and sleep in that. Um, so it was mostly living the same life, and I lived in Seattle proper at the time. So I was living in this big city, and I would 3 days a week I'd go out and travel to go to this school outside of the city, and then we'd have longer weekend or week long events as well. But I would say that the herbs and the plants, I was more easily able to incorporate them into my everyday life, and so I was harvesting them and bringing them home and regularly eating them and making medicine out of them.
Do you suppose, because I think about this as an Australian, do you suppose there's something about the fact that you grew up somewhere less lush, that when you get to the Pacific Northwest and it stops becoming, well, first of all, it's quite a bright and thick wall of green that you're then kind of individualizing into different species and so on. Do you think there's an element of you growing up somewhere like Utah that made the sort of the green shine brighter for you?
Possibly. I remember being very enamored with the Pacific Northwest when I first got there, just that sense of wow, the wonderment of the moss and the lichens and the just the lush greenness of everything was pretty profound
Mm.
for me.
So that's interesting
So,
because I moved from Australia to New Zealand when I was like 21 and a half. And the same thing happened. Like the smell of green in a place
mhm,
that gets, it doesn't have an issue with rain, like to say the least, it doesn't have an issue with rain. There's plenty of it. And just
mhm,
the difference that makes when you're in a kind of green environment, which isn't to say places like Utah and Australia aren't, you know, powerful and impressive in their own way, but there is that
mhm,
first experience of green if you haven't grown up around it.
mhm. Yeah, it always felt um even though I learned so many plants there and I became connected to the earth there in a really profound way, I would say like I always felt a little bit of an alien there. Like it never really felt like home or, like completely natural to me. And now I live on the other side of the mountains in Washington state, so it's like 4 hours east of Seattle. And the climate here is much more like what I grew up in northern when I moved to northern Utah. It's a high desert. But the botanical diversity here is just amazing. There's so many more um, at least it feels like just a lot more botanical diversity than on the west side, as we say.
So, what was the thing? I mean, we'll take the story back to learning the primitive skill stuff.
Hmm.
What was the thing that was there a moment where you decided actually I'm going to do this herb thing professionally? Was there an inciting incident for that?
There was actually, yeah. So at first, I think at first I got into it be out of fear. Honestly, it was kind of a like, oh, I'd better learn how to forage in the wild and how to build primitive shelters and kind of a like if civilization falls situation, then this is what I need to do. And so it became initially kind of a fear-based learning experience, but that pretty quickly faded into just loving it and really loving that connection to the earth and loving to be able to go out into the woods and feel safe there and find nourishment there, find medicine there, etc. So I was doing that for a while, and then I came down with a really weird illness. I had this strange rash for a couple of months that would move all over my body. So I'd wake up one day and it'd be on my chest, and the next day it'd be gone from my chest, but it'd be on my legs, and it was really bright orange and itchy, and so. But I just kind of ignored it, and I was like, "Oh, that's weird." And then I started getting a little bit of joint pain here and there, and I thought, "Oh, that's weird," but I just kind of ignored it. And then one day I like woke up and I could barely move. I was in so much pain, just this severe joint pain, and I had this incredible fever. And I basically had that for a month. This incredible fever. It'd go to 104 at night. I'd wake up in the morning, it'd be gone, or to 99 degrees. And the joint pain was so intense. All I could do in bed, I could just lay in bed was the only thing I could do. And to get up to go to the bathroom was just excruciating. And so I did that for a month and finally went at first I just thought it was a flu, but at some point I was like, all right, this is not a flu. And I ended up going to the emergency room. It took a team of specialists a couple weeks, and they finally came back and they said, you have a very rare autoimmune disease. And because it's so rare, we don't really know anything about it. We did find this brochure for you. So here, take this brochure. There's a Yahoo listserv that you can join. Know that there's no cure, and I was probably 23 at the time, and they said you can expect to live until you're 40. And
Charming.
yeah, that was it. I mean, they basically showed me the door, which was
Well,
a
after they
great
gave you the bill, that must have been
right,
an expensive pamphlet they gave you.
right. Yeah, I actually remember I was in the hospital for 4 days. It cost $24,000.
Yeah. Ah,
Yeah.
carry on.
um, so that was a great gift. actually for them to not have any answers for me and to just turn me away, because immediately it took me like 2 days, and then I was like, all right, like this is not it for me. And so I just started searching for answers anywhere I could find them. And I went to naturopaths and acupuncturists and herbalists, and I did a lot of my own research. And with all, I dramatically changed my diet from what I thought was really healthy. I was eating lots of wheat and soy and, vegetarian based stuff. And I had to stop all that. And I took lots of really horrible Chinese formulations. Horrible in that they tasted, just so intense. It was horrible. But I did all of that. And within 6 months, I had no more symptoms. And that was another really transformational experience for me, and another time when I just had a major paradigm shift of how the world works. Because up until then I thought, plants, they're so much fun, and it's really nice to get out and connect with them, but it's a hobby. It's what we do for fun. And if you have they can help you, like if you have a mosquito bite or a bee sting, you can use a plant and it'll help that. But if you have an autoimmune disease or some kind of chronic illness, like you're going to want to go to Western medicine. And that experience showed me that, oh, herbs have a lot more to offer than I had thought. And so I felt certain at that point that there must be other people out there who were going through a similar experience to me, like they had been diagnosed with an illness and that Western medicine had said, sorry, we don't have anything for you. And that they also wanted to have, more say in their health, more natural solutions. And so it was that point that I was like, oh, I'm going to do this is my life's path, is learning about how to use herbs in this way to help people.
That's a very shamanic illness you had.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely, at the time, it's so easy to look back on it now, because at the time I was full of fear. I mean, it was, probably the biggest, scariest thing that had ever happened to me. And looking back on it now, it feels like that hero's journey, like when you're watching a movie, the hero's going to overcome it, and so I feel grateful to be able to say like, oh, I made that hurdle, but even at the time it was
right.
so scary.
Let's not diminish that. I mean, if you were 23 and in constant pain and then told you've got 17 years left tops, have a pamphlet, $24,000, please. I don't think it's a very good day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you find, here's an odd question. When you sort of asserted sovereignty over your own health, like when you said, no, fuck this, I'm going to try I'm going to try traditional methods, but I'm also going to do my own research. Did you find that process in some way began to alleviate the symptoms? This is what I was maybe wondering about, because it's a classic shamanic illness where you essentially have to die to become the thing that can then turn around and help other people who are going through stuff. And I just wonder, did you notice like a change in how the symptoms presented as you were kind of beginning to assert that sovereignty?
That's a great question. I don't know that I remember, it's being so long ago. I kind of remember like little milestones. Like I remember one day just laying out in the sun, and I remember that just felt so, like, it's cliche, but it felt so radiant to me. I just felt like my whole body was like knitting itself back together.
Cool.
So I remember like little kind of things like that, of and coming together, but I can't remember that it didn't, just that the process in great detail.
And so once you'd made the decision, like what's day one when you're like, right, so I'm going to be like a professional or clinical herbalist or whatever. Like what's the thing you do immediately after that?
Well, I think I tend to have a pretty obsessive personality, and that just kind of helped me tenfold with that, to just really, it's like I lived and breathed for the plants and just to learn every single thing I could about them. And, at the time I was studying with an ethnobotanist. And so we were, the main focus of studies was humans interacting with plants. And so, as I've mentioned before, it was everything from basket making to, what have you, all the way to medicinal herbs. And so after that, I began to focus more on medicinal herbs, and later, this more direct, like clinical use of herbs. And so more of this understanding of how herbs work in the body, physiologically, and all that kind of stuff. So it kind of took a turn from being not just an ethnobotany focus, but to a more clinical focus.
And that was, I mean, so there was the research that was going on, but were you kind of looking into how it's when you wade into the field of being an alternative to medicine, you get into some kind of like legally or regulatorily fraught areas. Was there a way you go,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, if I'm going to step this up and do this,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what was that about? Are there schools that you went to? Are there
Mm-hmm.
things you go, okay, I'm actually going to take this seriously enough to get a piece of paper that keeps essentially the feds away and carry on.
Yeah, I did go to several schools beyond that one, and I did get pieces of paper. They here in the United States, they don't do anything in terms of like they don't allow you to practice medicine, for
Sure.
example.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I went to East West School of Herbology. It was a 4-year degree. I studied it intensely with the North American Institute for Medical Herbalism. I mentored with Carter Podick Singh Khalsa for a number of years. So I did like I said, obsessive personality. I just really went for it, did everything I could possibly think of. But I think in terms of the question of how do you navigate that world of the legal world is for me, number one, I've never let it really bother me a lot. Like I get that question a lot from herbalists now, that they're very concerned about that, just starting out. Didn't really concern me a lot. But I think one thing that really helped was that in my heart, I'm very clear that I'm not a doctor. I'm not trying to be a doctor. I don't want to be a doctor. Especially how we see many doctors practicing today. At least here in the States, you go in, you have 5 minutes, they write you a script, and you're gone. They, are oftentimes recommending things that suppress symptoms instead of actually getting at the root cause. Uh, the way I see it is, as an herbalist, I'm here to share my own knowledge and experience with people. I'm here to share my love of herbs and share with them different healing journeys that might be available to them. And it's their own prerogative. It's their own healing path of where that takes them. And so I don't take on a responsibility of like I'm here to diagnose anyone or cure anyone or solve everyone's problems, but really that I'm here as a supporting role to share what I have with people in the hopes that they will be able to get a lot out of that, of course. But I just feel like I'm never in that role where I would say like, oh, you have cancer? Oh, well, I'll take care of that for you. Let me give you some herbs. That's not me at all. So
Gotcha.
I don't worry about that from a legal perspective.
So, well, I mean, this is probably a good point for some definitions then, because you mentioned you kind of began the professionalizing journey from studying in ethnobotany, and now you do have some pieces of paper. So, this is difficult. This is why I was thinking about it as I was putting the questions together for the show. But what even is herbalism, particularly in our modern context, and what are its ancestors? Because I think that's slightly different.
Mm-hmm. Well, still from one of my good friends, fellow herbalist Jim McDonald, and he says if you use herbs, then you're an herbalist,
Yeah,
and that
fair enough.
that,
Yeah,
that's the definition right
it's
there.
clean. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, there's attempts in different countries to further define that and maybe separate professional or clinical herbalists from the home herbalist, and that's a big headache and a great way to start a fight if you walk into a room of herbalists and ask questions like that. But um, so it's an interesting thing here in the U.S. in that anybody can call themselves an herbalist, and I think rightfully so because it's our birthright to be enmeshed with the plants. Um, and people do different things with that. Some people simply grow herbs, and some people make herbal remedies for their family, or they really take food as medicine, to very seriously, or they make products they sell, or they teach classes or they write books, or some people have this clinical aspect. And I say clinical really to mean that, like, as a clinical herbalist, I meet one-on-one with people. I hear about their health issues and we work together as a team. So, kind of focused on that area.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, carry on.
mhm. It's an interesting thing about our ancestors. What does that mean in terms of our ancestors? And that, like, we just live in a very strange time where the idea of me coming out and talking about connection to plants or using herbs for health would in any way seem like not completely obvious, right?
Yeah.
Because that is our birthright. Is that we, they did really cool study, or not a study, but they exhumed some skeletons that were 800,000 years old, and they have this new technology where they look at the tartar on the skeletons, and then they can see what these people were eating 800,000 years ago. I mean, that's kind of a crazy time period to think about, 800,000 years ago. So they found that not only were they eating things that we would assume that they were eating, like meat or tuberous, vegetable food things, that they were also eating things like white willow and fennel seed and maidenhair fern, like these things that we know are medicine. They aren't really food, they're medicine. So you think about that, and our Paleolithic ancestors dancing with plants in a very intimate way for assuredly much longer than that. This is just what we know of. Then, I mean, it's honestly like just a huge.
Yeah, it's the modern day that's abnormal. Like we talk
Right,
about it
right.
as if, I mean, the reality when you talk about something like alternative medicine, I beg to differ. I think
Mm-hmm,
the one that has Pfizer and Merck and so on is the alternative to
mm-hmm.
what has been otherwise a journey that is inextricable to the human journey.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and it's a travesty. I mean, it's horrible that we have lost that connection. And that's where I see my role and I think many herbalists feel this way, is plants have reached out to us. They've said, here we are, let's restore this connection and let's reawaken, our culture to this connection to the plants.
Well,
Um,
yeah, that's certainly music to Rune Soup listeners' ears. There are some that we've kind of noticed because I'm particularly interested in the use of entheogens in clinical environments for depression and addiction treatment and that kind of stuff. So your classic psilocybin and ibogaine and that kind of stuff. And if you look at something like ayahuasca as a spirit, she appears to be a spirit on a mission, like having to, if it's one of those, if you want something done, you've got to do it yourself. And she's had to get up from the jungle and wander the world waking people up.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
When,
that's an interesting way of looking at it.
yeah, exactly. It's I call it sort of returning animism to the big table as a descriptor. Because I think you mentioned naturalism at the beginning, but the naturalism that we have, that we see it, kind of emerges from that Cartesian split where we've split things like mind and matter and kind of have a
Mm-hmm.
mechanical universe view of the natural world, even saying that the natural world is this artificial category because it is an impossibility that it's separate from us. So there's
Mm-hmm.
kind of implications if you move all the way up the decision tree to maybe 400 years ago, where that sort of head trauma happened to Northwest European thinking. If you move all
Mm-hmm.
the way back up there and kind of shift a few things around, you come back down the timeline to where we are, and without at all invalidating scientific observation and the use of things like microscopy and studies of cells and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't change it at all. It just changes the ontology of what it is we're actually talking about. It's no longer dead or mechanized. It's alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So when I'm talking about the other ancestors of herbalism, you kind of mentioned it, where you're talking about people who practice today using food, and then there's the sort of classic "let food be their medicine." Here's a kind of more challenging one as well. is food different from herbs in a asserting sovereignty over your own health sense? Is it in what ways is it different if it is?
Yeah, I would say um, not different. And in some sense, that split that we were talking about, it's even that herbs should be seen differently,
Yeah.
as food. That doesn't have to exist. Like there are certainly some plants out there that are very medicinal. We would not consume them as food, but um, the fact, I mean, I just think of like standard North American cuisine, right? The hamburger and the fries and the ketchup and all that kind of stuff, like where there's not an herb in sight. Like that's kind of another just crazy thing that our culture is dealing with, and that many other foods around the world still have, are still chock full of tons of herbs and spices. So again, another kind of strange thing. Like that's I spend a lot of my time talking about incorporating herbs into our foods, and it's a strange thing that that would even be something that we have to talk about and something that's not just entirely self-evident. But um, yeah, did that answer that question?
It does. I think that as well. The We just don't have that many mineral accumulators in the diet for a variety of reasons, industrialized ones, largely to start with. But it just kind of reminded me what you were saying about uh, almost if the herbalists that are practicing in the Anglosphere today do their job correctly, they'll put themselves out of a job. And
Hmm.
in a weird way, talking about food is sort of the same thing. We're like it's like you're treating a patient after a serious car accident and it has to learn to walk again, and he or she has to learn to hold things with her hand, like the restoring herbalism and restoring an understanding of food as medicine and so on seems to be things you go, well, I don't have to go to India to do this because they get it, or or Peru or wherever. Like they haven't had the same like industrialized car accident experience that requires this hopefully temporary treatment.
Hmm. Yeah, and that makes me think about even how the people approach herbalism, even like now. Just speaking of people in North America, that where it's easy to find herbalists who say like, oh, you have this X issue, so let's take this herb. And that's kind of where
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
teaching ends, right? Like
yeah.
we're going to use an herb to fix this. But this growing appreciation within herbalists right now, and I really feel like this kind of this like up and coming nugget of another paradigm shift, is understanding that in order to be healthy, we need to be saturated in plant life. If we look at our ancestors, we know that they ate hundreds of different plants throughout the year. Now we eat something like 10.
Yep.
So I think of it as like we know that we can only go, like if we don't breathe, that we will be dead within, you know, seconds to minutes. If we don't have water, we know that will be dead within days. If we don't have food, a couple weeks we could probably last. But I think we're in this cultural experiment now where we have pared down our foods, especially plant foods, to 10 or less. In this, I'm just talking broadly speaking, in the if we look at the standard American diet here in the US anyway, that we've simplified it so much. And so we're in this cultural experiment of how long can we last
The entire
without,
culture runs on survival food, absolutely.
yeah. And so that's another idea of like food as medicine is not just like eating a serving of carrots, but what if we add 10 different herbs and spices to those carrots, thus increasing this diversity of phytonutrients for our body, and what that does in terms of interacting with our DNA and turning things on, switching things off, and giving our bodies this diversity of nutrients to work with.
Well, I a million percent agree, and I want to pick that back up. But something you mentioned earlier, where you will find there will be some herbalists who will still do a sort of diagnostic treatment approach rather than essentially a preventative one, is something I'm particularly interested in, given
Hmm.
that the state of, in particular in the US, replacing a almost broken healthcare system with a completely broken one But and regardless of that, looking at how around the West um, healthcare spending is allocated, and 85% of it goes to treatment rather than prevention. But if you kind of even added an extra 10% to the prevention side, you actually drop the cost of everything further
Mhm.
back up the
Mhm.
timeline. And it's that when you talk, it's interesting to see that you'll find herbalists who are still operating in that same sort of head trauma incident, or that dialectic of treatment rather than prevention. And what you're talking about and what's coming through, hopefully, is the idea that, well, actually, no, your time is much better spent at the prevention side. And the prevention side isn't like, you should have some more turmeric. It's,
Mhm.
I mean, everyone should, and whatever. That's not actually what I mean. But the point is, yes, it appears that there's a net uplift if you kind of take an almost ecosystemic approach. I spent the last year playing around with microbiome research and doing that sort of
Mm.
fasting and trying to get as many species as possible. My last book actually mentions the fact that we eat around 10 species a week when, yes, even in the winter, you'd get, based on looking at Neolithic bones and so on, a minimum of 25 a week in winter. And you think, well, that's probably a big factor in what's going on. And that kind of increasing gut diversity has that cascade effect through the immune system and cognitive health. And it seems like we're right at the beginning of that kind of brand new day research. And what I love about this stuff is, and there's something metaphysically significant about it, that all this cutting edge research seems to just point further and further back to kind of traditional methods. And it's this odd roundabout journey we seem to have gone on over the last 450 years.
Mhm. Yeah, that is so true. Yeah, it's nothing it's nothing new. But a remembering almost of what we lost.
Yeah, my one of my favorite sort of modern day thinkers is Nicholas Nassim Taleb, and he doesn't eat or drink anything that his sort of Levantine ancestors in about 200, not even 200, so in about 200 AD, if they didn't recognize it as food or wine or whatever, he doesn't eat it. And that's that kind of extension of the idea of don't ever eat anything that your grandmother wouldn't recognize as food.
Mhm.
He's actually landed it on that, because then he gets the you know he gets water, wine, tea, and I think it's about 500 AD, because that's around when you start to see things moving back further in from Eurasia. But so he's essentially got the diversity, and he's got most of the drinks, but obviously no soda, none of that kind of stuff. And he mathematically decided that this is, from a risk management perspective, the absolute best way. When we don't know what we're talking about with nutrition and so on in the West, the best way to
Mhm.
do it is this. And it's this really interesting heuristic that I think about sometimes. So he doesn't eat anything that they wouldn't recognize as food.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that sentiment. Certainly makes me think of Joe Robinson. She wrote a book, Eating on the Wild Side. Are you familiar with that book?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's a cool book in that she looks at all these different fruits and vegetables and how they've been changed over the millennia from, like tomatoes used to be these very small, kind of bitter, sour things, but they were loaded with phytonutrients and antioxidants. And now we've bred them to be bigger and bigger and sweeter, but there's so much, they're lacking in so much of the nutrients that they once had. And so her book is about how to regain those kind of more ancestral plants through whether you're getting the seed to grow them yourself, or even just like being at your local farmers market or grocery store and being able to look and suss out like, oh, which ones are the nutrient dense ones that were the foods of our ancestors.
And I think this is one of those, because we were talking before we hit the record button about things like permaculture. For people who live in cities, and I'm going to ask you about this towards the end when it comes to growing things, that's all good. everyone doesn't necessarily have to wander off and become a market gardener, as long as you know your farmer, as long as you
Hmm.
have kind of full visibility over the life of the foods that you consume, which again we actually used to know
Hmm.
who grew or prepared our food, and
Hmm.
because there's simply no salvation coming from industrial agriculture, because the soil, the plants that grow in the soil is reduced in its sort of minerals, but the way that the plants actually grow from a root perspective means that they can't ever get deep enough to accumulate the minerals anymore. Like it'll literally never get fixed. There's nothing you can add to restore from industrial agriculture the nutrients that we have lived on for millions of years.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
you kind of have to ask yourself, in that treatment preventative way, at what point do you prioritize this in your life? Because you might be fine now, but eventually you won't be. And particularly in the US, that gets extremely expensive. Like that's the source, the largest source of bankruptcy is, of course, a poor health diagnosis. So does
Hmm.
allocating the time and potentially even the money, um, is that actually, can you provably say that's the right thing to do? And I think we can.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think there's an adage. It's um, like a mechanic, would always take care of his tools. And as a human, like we need to always take care of our body. And that's again like just something that's not culturally appreciated. Like I think, at least I can say I was taught for many years that you just kind of ignore your body and just assume that things are gonna, it's not something you have to actively think about every day, right? You just have
No,
your
it
Pop
just carries
Tart
on. Yeah.
and
And then when you get indigestion, you take something and
yeah,
carry
you
on.
take a pill and
Yeah.
keep going on. Yeah, yeah.
My father's a psychiatrist, and I house sat for them while they were off in Myanmar last month, because they have dogs. And I showed up, and it's classic. I'd been really busy, and I thought, this will be fun. I'll have a house to myself, and I can get some projects done and whatever. And of course, as soon as you stop, you kind of get ill. So I showed up, and I was in the beginning of, it was just man flu, but like it wasn't anything serious. But he's like, right, well, he's a psychiatrist, so he's like, right, well, here's some antibiotics. Take them for a week. And I'm like, I forgot that you people think like that.
Well, that's actually something that I feel like I was very much raised in, the dominant culture of take some weird pink syrup for whatever ails you or swallow this pill. But I've been so immersed in herbs and using herbs and recommending that people use herbs and teaching about herbs for long enough now that it seems so bizarre to me that people would risk their health by taking pharmaceuticals. Now, I have to say that I don't like blanket, hate Western medicine or think all pills are bad or anything like that. But like when it comes to many pills, they are, in my opinion, harmful when
Yeah,
you could use herbs that are just as effective that aren't harmful.
there's no
But
question about that. And the thing
mhm,
is, I mean, because I was given antibiotics as a teenager for, I think, vain reasons like acne, and I've
mhm,
had microbiome problems ever since. And you go, well, do you think so? So I spent my adolescence destroying gut flora,
mhm,
and it's never really recovered. And it was just really surprising, because I wouldn't. I agree with you, and I also, because usually when you have these discussions, people do the caveat of like, see your doctor about changing whatever, and I get all that, but I kind of want to. I'm perhaps like you, I want to push it a bit further and say, here's the thing. The US is 5% of the world's population, and it consumes 70% of the prescription drugs and 85% of the psychotropic painkillers. Now, you aren't that sick. Like what happened to Americans for that to be the case? And isn't it interesting that it's the country that has the
mhm,
most lax laws around pharmaceutical advertising? And that's why I
mhm,
think, because usually when we have these conversations, you have to do the hand wave and say, see your doctor before you make any changes, and that's all good. But by the same token, usually the comments under a discussion like this are like, yes, but in my case, I have this, and I go, push a little harder on that, because trust me, on the other
mhm,
side there are other ways of doing it, and antibiotics is a good one. It's good to save people's lives in a hospital,
mhm,
but I had a
mhm.
flu, and
Right,
I was
right.
going to fast and take some anti-inflammatories, because um I was actually going to ask you this. but inflammation is the sign of basically everything wrong in the body. So uh, that and the immune system are the kind of two things you need to get herbologically correct, and really a lot of the other stuff kind of diminishes. But it was just really surprising that he just came, and they were doxing too. So these were like doxycycline.
Mm-hmm.
This is the like boom antibiotics, and I'm like, come on,
Mm-hmm.
come
Mm-hmm.
on, for a flu.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing because like you, I've spent a lot of time just fascinated with all the microbiome research out there, and it's while I recognize that maybe there will be a time in my life when I have to, choose to take antibiotics, I can definitely say that I will do everything in my power to never have to take them.
I think that's the rule. Like I would have to be like a lot sicker. Like I'm talking in hospital infection risk kind of stuff, and in which case that's fine. But yeah, like I agree completely. Like I said to him, I said to my dad, I'd have to be a lot sicker to take these
Hmm.
than I am, and you set back. And in the end, because I was sick and flus make you hungry and whatever, I ate terribly because I couldn't really get out of the house. So I sort of the microbiome took a hit anyway, but it's almost a pyrrhic victory to avoid the antibiotics in that case. But it's really interesting when you come up against it. But I suspect, because I want to talk about immune health, I suspect
Hmm.
given your own journey towards herbalism, this might be an area of particular interest for you, and it's
Hmm.
one of those things that there's no such thing, I suspect, at least as far as I can tell, there's no such thing as having too robust an immune system. So, what are some of the things that people can do listening to this show? Because it's almost
Hmm.
like, obviously, check if you're talking about herbs, if they do contravene, or if they're contraindicated for medications you're on, etc., pregnant, etc.
Hmm.
With that out of the way, what are some of the things people can do for immune health that they may not be aware of?
Well, people are probably aware of this by now, but I would start by talking about a non-herb, but a hormone called vitamin D. And I feel like, when I was first sick, 15 years ago, vitamin D was not talked about the way it is today. And I think that was a big part of my own illness. I'd been living in the Pacific Northwest for 5 years. Um, so if we don't have a healthy vitamin D status, it's kind of like we're cutting our immune system off at the knees, right? So that would be one thing to think about. Um,
How do you get that
and
if people are in a low light environment?
so if you are in a low light environment, there's a couple things you can do. One, we know that actually using soap on the skin inhibits our body to absorb vitamin D. So I'm a fan of the no soap on skin except where the sun doesn't shine. There's some places you might want to use soap, but there's no need to use soap over your entire body every day or even every week. I think using a exfoliating brush or something to get some fresh skin cells is great, but we're actually inhibiting vitamin D production when we do that. So you want to avoid doing that. You want to always, you never want to burn in the sun. So that's always bad. But you can get sunlight exposure when it's available, morning, late evening, when it's not, um, and avoiding such prolonged exposure that you get burned. So there's those kind of things you can do whether you live in a sunny place or
I want
just
to
do
jump
to
in
your
there.
best.
Yeah, as
Uh-huh.
an Australian, I want to jump in there about the sun as well, because similar to the soap thing, I went to Miami for work a couple of years ago, and I found out there, because we assume sunscreen is some sort of um, medical invention. Some guy on Miami Beach invented it and just started selling it. And that's genuinely the origin of where sunscreen came from. And if you look at the
Mm-hmm.
ingredients of it, you go, so wait a minute, I'm going to baste myself in petrol and
Mm-hmm.
lie out in the sun. So,
Mm-hmm.
so what Rosalee's suggesting with
Mm-hmm.
regards to um, avoiding the peak of the sun but still getting sun is the way to do it, rather than slathering something that was invented on Miami Beach to make money. Um, is the way to go.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thanks for that clarification. So I do think that supplementation might be necessary for people. And really, the best way to know if it is or not is to get your vitamin D levels tested and do everything you can to get appropriate sun exposure. Because I think that sun exposure is going to be far more profound and helpful to your body than a supplement ever will. But a supplement might be kind of a necessary thing. And again, by regularly getting your vitamin D tested, then you can know, do I need to supplement? And, if so, how much supplementation do I really need? And maybe in the summer, you might need less, et cetera. So it's kind of something that's not like super easy in that it can take some learning to go into. But I think that's a really profound way to just make sure your body's supported with the nutrients it needs. With immune function, to bring it back to the herbs, is kind of that thing that we were talking before is like, oh, do you just take herbs when you're sick or some other thing? And I think the more that we challenge our body with a wide range of nutrients, the healthier it's going to be. And there are so many things that support immune system function that can be a part of our everyday life, like garlic, for example. Interesting studies, scientists looking at this, showing that it actually stimulates certain immune functions and can help, keep you strong, not just if you're sick, but as a daily part of your life. One of my favorite herbs for the immune system in general is astragalus, and that's astragalus, which comes originally from China. I don't know about its availability in Australia. I know it's big here in the U.S., so people are growing it. And
we can get it in health food stores and so on. It hasn't hit the two main supermarkets in any real way yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's still kind of obscure here. You wouldn't know about it unless you're an herbalist. But that's a really amazing herb in that it's a food-like herb that can be used as a food, in that you could use it every day. And it usually comes in strips of root, and you can throw that in, with whatever else you're cooking, like a soup or a rice or something that has a water content, and you can cook that with your food. That's how it was used traditionally in China. And it also, we say it modulates the immune system, and so it helps support broad immune system function just for health, and so again, we can argue that perhaps by missing out on these, I've just talked about two simple ones, astragalus and garlic, but there's so many herbs out there that support immune system function, and because we've been genetically interacting with plants for so long, I think that we need these plants in our everyday life in order to help stimulate, challenge, provoke our immune system and keep it strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of like the hygiene theory, right? Like we kind of have this growing idea that like if we aren't exposed to pathogens and parasites and worms when we're young, then that can we're seeing this correlation to it leading to chronic health problems later in life. So this idea that if our immune system isn't challenged early on, then it's going to have trouble expressing itself in a healthy way later in life. And so I think that's same thing for herbs. Like herbs are challenging and provoking our immune system, and we need them to do that.
Yeah, kids and dirt is another example of one of those things that we have to be told when no one else has to be told. And again, I go back to, say my grandparents growing up as little kids didn't they just played in the dirt because, that's what there was. And it's really interesting that we had that kind of post-war period of TV ads and spray cleaners and soap and all the other kind of stuff that happened that appears to have had, some quite serious long-term effects on boomers and Gen X and millennials, although I think we're coming out of it. It's amazing. It's one of those things that we had to unlearn along with food diversity and so on, that no one else had to unlearn.
Yeah, and it's kind of a creepy thing. Like I don't we don't have like cable television or anything, so I don't see like television ads. But I was at a hotel a while ago and turned on the television, and the ads were just like, they kind of it was all like cleaning ads, and like kills 99.9% of bacteria, from like cleaning your bathroom to cleaning your kitchen to like clothing being antibacterial to your laundry detergent.
Your hands,
washing like I just like could not, like, it was a weird thing to like look at it and just be like, whoa. And that's how I grew up.
Yeah.
getting those messages. I don't get them anymore, but it was
No.
a weird thing to see them still out there
It's
and so
funny that
prevalent.
you see an ad message like kills 99.9% of germs, and they're using it. You say, you think that's a pro? You're trying to tell me to buy this because that's a good thing. And it was kind of like my father with the antibiotics. I'm like, oh right, you think that's good? It's
Hmm.
the opposite. I'm like, alarmed watching this commercial.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, those are a couple of really helpful ones. You have this amazing new book out. Of them, and what I really like this because it's kind of what I was getting at before with herbalism and its ancestors, because we've been talking about some ethnobotany, we've been talking about some clinical studies, and there's something about herbalism in the modern day that, because it is a restorative that, if it does its job correctly, goes away, if we think about it like that. There's a
Hmm.
combination of something like really deep exploration of things that are readily available if you buy them at the farmers markets. So let's look at it. Having said all that stuff about uh, going for diversity, what are a couple of the ones that people are sort of that are in the book that are readily available for people to maybe incorporate? Something like turmeric, which is I'm a fan of. Last year in Sydney, turmeric lattes were the thing, but I've been using it as an anti-inflammatory for a long time. So like a couple of them like that, if we want to talk about it.
Sure. Um, you've kind of just asked me to like pick my favorite children, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh, um,
Rosalee's
so
choice.
so one favorite one that I love to talk about is dandelion. And I wrote this book, Alchemy of Herbs, and it's about using herbs and spices. And I wanted to make it broadly appealing to people, so it would be in like the cookbook section, right? And people would be like, "Ooh, cinnamon or turmeric," or these kind of things that are generally well known. And then I put in what I call gateway herbs. Uh, because I want to have this gateway into kind of expanding people's minds to not only what they might find in like the grocery store spice rack, but to plants that might be growing around them. And so I included things like dandelion and nettle and hawthorn. But I love to talk about dandelion because it is one of the most generous plants that I know. Practically every single, well, not practically, but every single part of it is incredibly useful, whether it's food or medicine. It even will give you a free wish if you blow the seeds off all at once. So it's an amazing plant. And here in the United States, people still spray this plant ubiquitously. It's something like 80 billion pounds of uh, herbicides are sprayed specifically on dandelions by homeowners every year. So it's wreaking incredible, havoc on our environment, and yet they're poisoning something that's so amazing. I don't really get it because it's so beautiful. Like, if you've ever seen like a
Yeah.
dandelion field, that's one of my favorite things in the summer. Watching all the bees, flit about. It's such a beautiful sight. But one of my favorite things is the leaves. And if you harvest the leaves in the springtime while they're still pretty young, then they have a great taste. That's kind of this crisp green taste that is slightly bitter. And I love to make pesto out of that. It's my favorite thing. So you harvest it. You basically make it as if you're making a basil pesto. In my recipe in the book, I also add things like turmeric. You'd appreciate that, and
Yay.
lemon juice and pine nuts. But it's so easy to make a pesto. Really, you just throw all the ingredients together. So dandelion leaves, olive oil, pine nuts, or whatever kind of nuts, or leave the nuts out. It's very, very forgiving. But basically, you whip all that up in a food processor or blender, and I just love to put that on everything in the springtime. And it's the perfect kind of spring tonic because that slightly bitter taste of the leaves is actually a really powerful way to stimulate your digestive enzymes. So that's another just common thing today, is that people, even people who are interested in, natural health or alternative health, will take digestive enzymes, like exogenous digestive enzymes, like from a pill, to help their digestion, because they know, they're like, oh well, I'm not I'm not digesting very well. I must not have these digestive enzymes, so I'll take digestive enzymes, so therefore I can digest better. So the thing about the bitter taste is that it stimulates all of those digestive enzymes. Like if you think about something really bitter, you might start salivating just thinking about it. And so that salivation, that's one of our first digestive enzymes, right? That breaks down carbohydrates. But this creates this whole cascade of events where then we're secreting hydrochloric acid in the stomach and all sorts of pancreatic enzymes. That bitter taste is also helping to stimulate the production and release of bile, which helps us digest our fats. So again, this idea of like, oh, should we take something because we're sick, or should we be incorporating bitter herbs into our life all the time so that we're constantly stimulating all of these digestive enzymes so that we naturally have them? So I love that with dandelion because it grows everywhere. It can be harvested from your front yard, made into medicine or food, and it's delicious. And it's just the act of taking it is really, ultimate food is medicine because, again, you're supporting your digestive enzymes.
Have you ever
So,
gone far enough to make like a dandelion coffee with the roasted tap roots? I haven't yet. I have
oh,
dandelion
Gordon,
leaves here, but like that's
that's like my favorite thing.
right.
Yeah. No, that is so good. So so basically what you do is you harvest the roots and chop them up and then you roast them. I just roast them like in a cast iron pan until they get really aromatic and they, darken in color, and then you just simmer that in some water. And it's this rich roasted beverage that is so delicious. That's one of my very favorite beverages. And the root is really nutrient dense, like you were talking before about bringing up minerals from the earth and into the plant. So those dandelion roots have these really long tap roots that they do that. They're pulling up all these nutrients. So very nutrient dense. And then the herbalists use the root specifically for liver health. And it's a very safe plant to use, but broadly and powerfully supporting of the liver. So what a great thing to be eating this weed out of your front door and basically taking like medicinal support for your liver.
Yeah, we've just had 2 weeks of rain. We're obviously heading into autumn in the Southern Hemisphere.
Right, right.
We've just had 2 weeks of rain. So whilst we got a spring flush of dandelions, which I ate the leaves from,
Hmm.
because I'm actually in an old churchyard slash graveyard in a river valley, so we have compacted clay soil. So I've sort of left them there because I need them to decompact the soil, right? And I
Hmm.
ate the leaves in the spring, and they've all come back because we've had 2 weeks of rain. And the
Hmm.
stuff that I had going over the summer, lawn replacement had died off. So
Hmm.
I'm wondering because I didn't want to remove the roots and roast them because I wanted them to
Well, you
stay
know
there. But
what
now I have
though?
loads of them, so maybe I will.
Yeah. And the roots are so incredible. If you harvest half the root, it'll keep growing.
That's true.
So you
Yeah.
can harvest like half of it, get your dandelion coffee going, and
All
then
right.
leave them there to keep growing. And then even just like the act of harvesting them, will loosen up the soils a bit and help the dandelions to spread even more. So,
Yeah, I'm into it because
mm,
I buy dandelion tea slash coffee, but I haven't made my own with my own
I
dandelions
see. I
yet.
see.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to do that. I think that'll be good. I'm going to do that in the autumn. Speaking of, okay, two more, and these are actual kind of like treatment ones, despite what we just said. So we're heading into cold and flu season, and you
Mm,
guys are heading into allergy season.
right.
So, like, what kind of things do we have ready access to that may be helpful in both of those situations?
Uh-huh. Well, so we mentioned astragalus. I love that. Like I started having astragalus chai. So basically like I simmer astragalus roots with things like ginger and cinnamon and cloves and cardamom. And I'll have that almost every day as we're starting in the fall. And it's warming and delicious. And basically you're supporting your immune system in a great way to help prevent you from getting colds and flus. But the thing that I also keep on hand at all times is lots of elderberries. And I believe you do have
Oh
elderberries
yeah.
in Australia. Yeah. So elderberries are so amazing. I first learned of them, in ethnobotany as a food, and we didn't really talk about them a lot as medicine, but they, beloved by herbalists now. They do. So how we think that they work is that, um, so you have all these cells in your body that make you, and you have a pathogen that might be in your body and senses like, oh, the time is right for me to start replicating. And what elderberry does is it prevents that virus from attaching to your cell walls and prevents it from replicating. So I always have lots of elderberries on hand, and I just take ubiquitous amounts if I ever feel, like those beginning stages, like, oh, there's the scratchy throat, or or whatever that feeling is for you. I just start drinking tons and tons of elderberries in order to just saturate my tissues with that and stop that process. And I have used that so many times to just stop getting, a cold or flu. And so I love that. It's kind of like do the most you can to prevent an illness from starting in your body, but elderberry is so great for just aborting it right away.
That's cool.
So,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
I
add
would
that
not
one.
be without it.
I'm going to add that one to the arsenal because usually the classic examples, and they do work in terms of, reduction of symptoms and shortening the case. Your sort of classic echinacea, and garlic being another example where as soon as you
Mhm.
start to get sick, if you start mega dosing within
Mhm.
safe reason on these things, you will shorten the duration. But I'm going to add elderberry to that arsenal.
Yeah, absolutely. If you make up so basically you take the berries, they can be dried or fresh, and you simmer them in water and then strain it out really well. So that's just your most basic elderberry mixture. And then some people add sugar or honey to that as a preservative. I generally don't. Like I make what I need and I'll just go through that in a day. But there's so many fun things you can do with it, like add cocoa powder and then drizzle that over your pancakes. Or there's so many, like it's a wonderful food. So it's a fun way to get it into your life, not just as a weird pink syrup.
All right, and is there anything? I guess we're in anti-inflammation territory if you're talking about mitigating allergy symptoms.
Yeah, well, there's so many herbs, but one that really comes to mind is actually astragalus again, because allergies are seen as kind of a imbalanced immune system, right? So the body is overly reacting to something. So astragalus can be a great way to help modulate that. Um, but another herb that really comes to mind is nettle. And nettle grows again everywhere. It grows in Australia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And temperate climates, and eating that when you so you can use it in a couple different ways. One way is fresh. So if you eat it fresh, or if you take the fresh alcohol extract, that can be a way to help. Basically, it's helping to modulate that histamine response. You can also take it dried as a tea. And what I recommend is you take approximately 28 grams, which, if you have finely crumbled leaf, is about couple handfuls, and you soak that in just boiled water, like a liter of just boiled water overnight, and then you strain that off the next day and drink it. So by the next day you get this like incredibly dark, like you can't even see through it, drink that's just so full of minerals and vitamins, and just basically your body's building blocks that you need. And so if you take that for a couple months before allergy season, I've seen time and time again, people just don't have the allergic response that they're used to having. Um, but for a quicker response, then you want to use that fresh preparation.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna bear that one in mind for when allergy season swings back around here.
Mhm.
That one sounds awesome. I know I have some friends out there in North America who are heading into allergy season with dread. So hopefully they can get on that as quick as possible.
Mhm. There are some side effects to nettle, though, that I should mention. Because you're having all those vitamins and nutrients, people notice that their hair is growing in stronger, that their nails are stronger, that they have better teeth, um, clearer skin. So take those into consideration.
Yeah, you might turn into a handsome werewolf.
Uh-huh,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, Rosalie, this has been a fantastic chat. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you so much.
For people who want to know more about yourself and about the book and so on, where do they go? What do they do?
Sure. Well, I just want to say first, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. So, a couple of ways. If you want to know more about the book, then it's best to go to alchemyofherbs.com. And we have a page there just dedicated to showing you what the book's about. If you want to get in touch with me directly, or see my website, which has tons of recipes and lots of herbal monographs and information about herbs, then that is herbswithrosalee.com.
Fantastic. And of course, these will be in the show notes.
Great. Thank you.
All right, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
How do you like them organic apple cider vinegars? Rosalee's book came out at an opportune time for me because I've been thinking about the US healthcare dumpster fire and what constitutes best practice over the next few years while it burns out and gets replaced with single payer, which I genuinely think will happen in the medium term given about 58% of the country wants it. But between now and then, a lot of you quite simply are just going to have to work out how not to die. Which means prevention is preeminent, and discussions like this and research like this, I suspect, will or should be a big part of that. It got me thinking about the Apocalypse Pharmaca post series on the blog a few years ago. I've actually been idly toying with resurrecting it. Somewhat dramatically in that series, Lucille Booth style, I asked, "Are we not poisoners?" And I suppose what I meant by that, and still mean, is we should be applying sufficient rigor and analysis to parsing what is and isn't valuable scientific and medical information from the worlds of both, allopathic and quote-unquote alternate medicine. This is a not all occultist statement, but in many ways we have conserved the wrong parts of Paracelsus or Culpeper by focusing on their specific formulations. But they both derived these formulations from the best available evidence of their day. So it's that method we should conserve rather than, a centuries-old output of an application of that method. Otherwise, we're forced to admit that both nature and magic stopped sometime in the past, which I don't think is a particularly accurate position. Anyway, food medicine for thought. Speaking of thoughts, let me know yours at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. Subscribe to the show and or find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.